So biological organization starts from biosphere, which means a planet. It includes everything from abiotic to biotic and includes multiple ecosystems. Right below biosphere is what we call the ecosystem. So an example of an ecosystem would be a tropical rainforest. A tropical rainforest in Madagascar. And it includes also abiotic, which is your non-living things, such as rocks, temperature, water, and biotic elements, which are your living organisms. So living organisms. Right under ecosystem is your community. Community only includes biotic factors, which are everything that are living organisms. So living organisms. So one of the examples could be a group of animals, and plants living together. Under community, it will be population. So a population is a group of one species. One specific species. So the key word here is one. So one species. So right under population is what we call organisms. So an organism is one individual living thing. Individual. Organisms is made up of different systems. We call it organ system. A few examples could be a respiratory system, which includes your lung, trachea, and if you wanted to include nose as well, right? So we can see that an organ system is a group of organs working together to perform a specific functions. So organ system is made up of different organs. An organ is a functional unit. A functional unit of multiple tissues for a specific function. So right under organ is your tissue. So tissue is basically just groups of one type of cell or multiple similar cells. So the keywords here is groups of cells. So what makes up tissues is the basic unit of life, which is cell. So since cell is being called the basic unit of life, everything that cell makes up are living organisms. Everything that can be broken down below cells are not living organisms. So if we go further down cells, everything here is non-living factors. So we know that cells is made out of organelle, which are the functional subunit in a cell. So if we go down organelle, it will be molecules. So molecules is basically your group of atoms bonded together So molecules is made out of atom, which is the basic units of matter. And matter is anything that occupies volume and it has mass. Certain students are a little bit confused in terms of DNA and nucleus. Nucleus is the center of the cell that contains your DNA. So nucleus is a type of organelle. Okay, so organelle. One example of organelles is nucleus. Some students might also know that another type of example for organelle is mitochondria. And we will talk more about this in a later chapter. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the thing that carries your genes. It is actually a type of molecule. So DNA is made out of tiny little atoms such as carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And we'll talk more about the structure of DNA at a later chapter. As of right now, you need to know that DNA is not an organelle. DNA is molecule. So I'm going to highlighting this to emphasize the differences. The next chapter that we'll be talking about is the methodology in classifying organisms. So the methodology used by biologists to categorize organisms or to classify organisms. Let's see. So the study of classification of organisms is what we call taxonomy. So taxonomy is a scientific study of classification of organisms, and it is classified from the least specific to the most specific. So the least specific of categories that we created is what we call the domain. And there are three domains of life: archaea, eukarya, and bacteria. So archaea and bacteria, they are what we call prokaryotes. They are prokaryotes because they lack a nucleus. They do not have a nucleus as their DNA storage. Eukarya is eukaryotes. It means they have a nucleus. Prokaryotes are also always unicellular. Not multicellular, unicellular. Uni means one, cellular, one cell. So prokaryotes are always consist of one cell only as individual organisms. Eukaryotes can contain unicellular or multicellular. So right under the domain of eukarya, you have different kingdoms. There are 4 kingdoms that you need to remember. The first kingdom is us, Animalia. The second kingdom that you need to remember is Plantae. Third kingdom, Protista. And the fourth one is fungi. You do not need to know exactly the differences, but you need to know that at least there are 4 different kingdoms under the domain of eukarya. So you can see that each kingdom is a more specific categorization than the big domain of eukarya. And as we go down the classifications of organisms, you always end up the last two names, which is genus and species. So species is the more specific way of naming each organisms. And genus is the second most specific way of classification of organisms. So for example, humans is Homo sapien. Homo sapien. This is the genus Homo, and species name is called sapien. So human belongs to the genus of Homo, and we are the species of sapien. You do not need to know, as of right now, what are the different types of genus or species, but you should get a general idea that when we're naming an organism, we always call it by genus and species. Okay. So, another thing that you need to know is Animalia is always consumer. So they do not make their food internally in their body, while Plantae is always producer. So they are able to produce food internally through photosynthesis. And fungi is decomposers. They can degrade biomaterial chemically. So they eat that stuff and break down into molecules. And Protista is always unicellular. And we will discuss more about Protista in a later chapter. So the properties of life. Properties of life. There's 7 of them. You should be able to remember each property of life and the definition of them and an example for each of them. The first one is order. Every living organism demonstrates some sort of pattern that is observable. For instance, every living organisms use DNA as their genetic storage. Second, energy processing. Every living organisms can process energy internally. So, human or animals can respire through respiration. So they breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, while plants process energy through photosynthesis. So they make food through the energy of sunlight. So photosynthesis and respiration are 2 examples of energy processing. So respiration. 3 is growth and development. So every living organism are able to grow from small to big. So an example would be a kitten grows up to become a cat. Seed grows up to become a tree. 4 is reproduction. Every living organism is able to reproduce and generate offspring. Offspring is just another word for babies or the next generation. 5 is evolutionary adaptation. So, living organisms are able to adapt to the environment and make changes to themselves. So as a whole, the whole population can evolve. Evolution just means change. Accumulated change. Collected change that affects your future generations. So one example would be the antibiotic resistance among the bacteria. 6 is response to the external environment. So respond to external stimuli, such as responding to what you see, dog barks at something that they see, smell, you move around, motions. So dog barks. And the last one is internal regulation. Living organisms are able to regulate their internal factors, such as temperature, so humans sweat, in order to cool themselves. So these are the 7 properties of living organisms. So next is the basic unit of matter. Matter is made up of atom. So atom is the basic unit of everything that exists in the world. And matter occupies space and weight. So it has a volume, I shouldn't say space, so it has a volume and it has a mass. An atom is made up of 3 subatomic particles: proton, neutron, electron. You need to know their charges. Protons is positive, neutron is neutral, electron is negative. So 1 proton equals to 1 positive charge, 1 electron is equals to 1 negative charge. Their location differs as well. Proton and neutrons are found in the nucleus, so nucleus, while electron is found in the orbit around the nucleus. In terms of mass, proton, it has 1 atomic mass, so 1 AMU, atomic mass unit, and neutron is also 1 atomic mass unit. So 1 proton weighs 1 and neutron weighs 1. While electron's weight is negligible, so electrons has no mass. It's very, very small, so we ignore the calculation for the mass of electron. So when you wanted to calculate the atomic mass for atoms, you need to look at the number of protons and the number of neutrons. So when we're saying an atom, so let's say oxygen atom, we name atoms by their number of electrons. By the number of protons. So oxygen's atom has 8 protons. And by definition, atom is neutral. Anything that is neutral must have equal number of protons and electrons. So an oxygen atom must also have 8 electrons. Because 1 proton is positive charge and 1 electron is negative charge. However, if we have an oxygen ion by definition has a net charge. It can be positive or negative. So net charge can be positive or it can be negative. When it is positive, it means that this particular oxygen ion has more proton than electron. And when it is negative, it means that it has more electron than proton. So we can create a net charge when there is an unequal number of proton and electron. So unequal proton and electron. So that's how we create ion. And every atoms has a fixed amount of neutron. And neutron is neutral. It has no charge. So oxygen atom has the probability of different number of neutron. In nature, usually the number of proton is equal to the number of neutron because it is usually the most stable format. So you'll usually see an oxygen atom with 8 neutron because it has 8 proton. But this does not need to be the case. Oxygen can also have isotope. So isotope means that this particular atom is neutral. It has 8 proton, 8 electron, but it has a different number of neutron. So for instance, this particular oxygen has 9 neutron. So if you measure the weight between oxygen atom and its isotope, this isotope will have 17 AMU, while this isotope will have 16 AMU. So they are both oxygen, but they weight differently, so they have different mass. Both are oxygen, but with different mass. In this scenario, we call them isotopes. So isotopes are elements that have the same number of protons. So element that has the same number of proton, but different number of neutron. In this situation, how do I know if how do I differentiate between two oxygen? So we write isotopes in terms of their mass. So the first oxygen here, if you take the example above here, this oxygen weighs 16 AMU, so it will be oxygen 16. So we write their mass right after the name of the element. And the second oxygen will be oxygen 17. And these two are the isotopes of oxygens. Okay. And elements are the most basic unit chemically. If you look at your periodic table, each atoms on the thing that you see on each block that you see on the periodic table is one element. So we have hydrogen, then helium, and you also have the more familiar one such as carbon, oxygen, chlorine, as well as magnesium, also nitrogen. The four most basic and essential elements for living organisms are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. If you have elements add up with another element, you end up having a compound or molecules. Depends on how they're related to each other, how they're being bonded together. So if they combine together, they will make a new kind of compound or material or molecules. So if you have two elements add up together and you form something new, we call the things that is formed later a product. And the things that happen before they were bonded together is what we call a reactant. This is what we call a reaction. There are some changes happen to the elements or atoms or molecules. They're no longer the same. So before the reaction are our reactants, and after the reactions is our products. Next, you need to know a little bit about the electron configuration. So electron configuration is how we put electrons at the shell. And you know that electrons has this energy level that starts from level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each energy level, so energy level for the electrons has a maximum number of electrons. The first level has a number of 2, the second level has a maximum of 8, the third level has a maximum of 18, and the fourth level has a maximum of 32. So if you add them up together, if you try to put in all the electrons that you have for each electrons, sometimes you'll end up having a few electrons at the outermost shell. So let's say, take for example, oxygen has proton number 6 and electron 6. Sorry, proton number of 8 and 8 electron to make it neutral. So if we put oxygen and label the electrons at the shell, so the first shell would have 2 electrons and the second shell will have 8 electrons. So I'm gonna use orange. So the one at the center here, this is our nucleus. So this is our nucleus. And this would be our 2 electrons at the first shell. So this is the first shell. And right after here is our second shell, or the second energy level. And we will have 6 of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I will have 6 electrons at the second shell. Since this shell is the outermost shell is what we call the valence shell. So valence just means outermost shell. And the number of electrons right at the valence shells is what we call the valence electron. So valence electron in this model, it will only have 6. So oxygen will have 6 valence electrons in its valence shell. And every atoms or elements would like to achieve the stable octet rule. So stable octet rule, which states that you would need to have a maximum number of electrons in the outermost shell, or your valence shell, because that is the most stable configuration. So elements or atoms are able to take or give away their valence electron in order to achieve this stable octet rule. So taking the case of oxygen, oxygen will need to take 2 more electrons from other elements in order to bring it into its own valence shell so that it has 8. If an atom gives away an electron, so for instance, sodium has 3 electrons. So sodium, it has 3 electrons, so 2 at the first energy level and 1 at the valence shell. It will need 7 extra electrons in order to fill in the valence shell. So for sodium, it is very difficult to get 7. So sodium will be very willing to give away this electron. In this case, now sodium becomes a sodium ion, because sodium, I will draw here. So giving away 1 electron, giving 1 electron away. So now sodium will only have 2 electrons left at the first shell. Since there is no more electron at the second shell, that shell no longer exists, so this is counted as the valence shell. And it has a maximum of 2 electrons, so this sodium has fulfilled the stable octet rule. So this sodium, now since this is a sodium, it still has 3 protons, but it only has 2 electrons. So if you calculate the net charge of it, sodium will have a net positive charge. So positive charge of 1. if we look at chlorine, chlorine has a proton of 17, so P equals to 17. And if we look at the number of electrons, so it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So chlorine will only need one extra electron. So chlorine is more than willing to just take one. Because this chlorine only needs one in order to fulfill his dream, this chlorine is very electronegative. Electronegative means they really want electrons. So the affinity or the likelihood of getting electron. So affinity, electron affinity. Electron affinity. So the sodium's electrons gonna get transferred to chlorine. So now chlorine will have 8 electrons, right? This chlorine's electrons is gonna move into the outermost shells to be the 8 for this particular chlorine. So I will redraw all the electrons for chlorine. So look carefully that this electron is going to move into the outermost shell, right? So if you count the number of electrons, there will be 18. Can't seem to erase that. Okay. Good. So now we have a total of 18 electrons for this chlorine. If we look carefully, we still have 17 protons because it is still chlorine, but now we have 18 electrons. If you do the math, we will realize that there is a net negative charge. So sodium is net positive, chlorine is net negative, so sodium is positively charged, chlorine is negatively charged. Positive will always attracted to the negative, so now they form some sort of attraction together. This is when a bond is formed. And we call this form ionic bond because I have a positive ions, an ion at the left hand side for sodium and an ion for chlorine that's negative. So now they're bonded together. So this is what we call an ionic bond. So this is an ionic bond. You can also share the electrons together between two atoms. So let's take the example of oxygen, so oxygen. So let me redraw oxygen. At this time, I'm going to draw only the valence shell. So I'm only going to draw the valence shell. So this is the valence shell of an oxygen. So the outermost shell of this oxygen will have 6 electrons. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it will need 2 more electrons in order to fulfill the valence shell. So this oxygen will be able to just share its electron with another oxygen who also wants another 2 electrons. I'm going to move this away. So now I will have 2 oxygen. You can see that they're slightly different, but they're both oxygen. So they're going to move together closely, closer, move together, closer, and create a common space in between. So this is a common space in between. So now every electrons that they put into this particular common space would become the common properties for both oxygen. So when you have a pair of electrons being shared, one contributed by each electron, we form a bond. So we'll draw a stick to represent one bond. So one stick equals to one bond. So 2 sticks we will call 2 bond. Since it's only 1 bond, we have an English word for this, we call it single bond. And it has 2 bonds, we call it a double bond. So what's the name of this when the atom shares electron between each other? This is what we call a covalent bond. So covalent bond is formed when atoms share electron with each other. So share electron. And if both atoms are the same, so if this is atom oxygen and this is also atom oxygen, they will have no differences in electronegativity. So no differences in electronegativity. Since there's no differences in electronegativity, we say this covalent bond as nonpolar covalent bond. Nonpolar covalent bond. Why is this nonpolar? Because there's no differences being created in terms of charges. Polar just means differences. So let's say if I create another oxygen, but this time it's bonded to 2 hydrogen. So oxygen, I'm gonna draw the valence shells again. So valence shell version, it has 6 electrons. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 valence electron is combined together with 2 hydrogen. So hydrogen will only have 1 valence electron. So 1 and 1. So I will use yellow to represent the electrons for hydrogen. So hydrogen, since it's in the first shell, so it will only need 1 electron to complete the valence electron, complete the octet rule. So the second hydrogen will also come close. So this oxygen will share 1 electron with each hydrogen. Right? So now you see that there is a pair of electrons being shared. So I will use the stake to represent a bond. So this is 1 bond. This is another bond. So now you see that this is actually a water. H2O. Right? 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. So this is really your water. So water has 2 covalent bonds. Not double bond because it is not 2 bonds in 1 region. And because there is differences in electronegativity, oxygen really likes electrons, so oxygen likes electron. And hydrogen doesn't really care that much. It's okay, so doesn't really like electron. So electrons will be closer to oxygen. It is some sort of unequal sharing. It's just because oxygen really likes the electron much better. So electrons are closer to oxygen, so electron will have a slightly negative charge, while hydrogen will have a slightly positive charge. Okay, so if we make a replicate of this water molecule, something's wrong. Okay. So let me copy this again. So water molecules. So copy, paste, and paste again. So now I will have 2 water molecules very close to each other. And this should be delta positive for hydrogen, and this is delta negative for oxygen. So we know that the positive and the negative region of atoms will attract each other. So there's some sort of attractions formed between this slightly positive and slightly negative region of water. This scenario is what we call hydrogen bond. So hydrogen bond is an attraction between delta positive and delta negative. It can be any element, but usually it is oxygens and hydrogen. And you will realize that it is in between oxygen from one molecule to hydrogen of another molecule, and oxygen has a delta negative charge and hydrogen has a delta positive charge. So this hydrogen bond contributes to many properties of water. And it is the property of water that you need to be aware of. So the properties of water. So because of this hydrogen bond, ice is less dense than water in liquid form. Because hydrogen bond will make the waters to arrange in a very specific order. So arrangement in a specific order that expands its volume. And because we know that density is really just mass over volume, if we do not change the mass or the number of water molecules in there, but we expand the volume of it, the density will decrease. Volume increases, density decreases. And because of this, fish in winter does not become frozen sashimi. Fish in the pond does not get frozen during winter, because ice floats onto the surface of water and it freezes only on top of the surface of the pond. So this is the first property. So the second property is the adhesion property and cohesion property. So adhesion is how water molecules adhere to the surface of other things. So let's say if I have a surface and I have a water molecule, and this water molecules likes to stick to the surface, and the surface, the attractions between water molecules and the surface is quite strong. So this is adhesion. And cohesion is how closely related between each water molecules, right? Cohesive. So water molecules like to stick together with other water molecules. So this is cohesiveness or cohesion. Because of waters like to pull together, they like to stick together with each others, and they stick to the surface very good, plants are able to pull out waters through transpiration. So if I have a tree, water goes into the plants through roots, right? So water, and water goes through the vessels in the tree. You can see that water has to go out against the gravity. So against the gravity, which is quite difficult. So water is able to go against the gravity because of the specific reasons of adhesion and cohesion due to hydrogen bond. Remember, hydrogen bond is a very strong attraction that can pull water together. So water eventually will leave the tree through transpiration through the leaves. So water will get transpired out of the leaves into the environment. And it's all because of adhesion and cohesion. Water also has high surface tension because of the adhesion and cohesion nature of water as well as the hydrogen bond. So surface tension. So water is able to hold together each other. So all these things that I draw here are water molecules. H2O, 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 H2O. So it is the surface of water, and when there's some insects able to crawl on water, it's because the insects will not drop into the water because water has very strong surface tensions. Number 4 is the cooling effect of water. Cooling effect of water. Because hydrogen bond is a type of bond and you need energy to break them down. So bond needs energy to break them apart, to break down, so that water molecules can be broken apart, right? So this is a hydrogen bond between two water. And you need some sort of energy to break this hydrogen bond, so I need energy to break down this bond, so energy will be absorbed into it. So energy is absorbed to break the bonds between two water molecules, so now these water molecules can escape and become water gas or water vapor. So it will absorb the energy, the heat energy. That's why humans sweat. The sweat will become water vapor and evaporates, and it absorbs the heat energy away from our body. And the last but not least would be the high specific heat of water. Sorry, water is also, I need to take that back. So water is a polar molecule. It means that water itself has delta positive and delta negative. So hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and hydrogen. Delta negative at the oxygen section and delta positive at the hydrogen section. So, because water is polar, it is a very good solvent. So solvent is a liquid that you can dissolve other things. So liquid that can dissolve. So a good example of solvent is water, H2O. Something that you dissolve in a liquid is what we call a solute. So solute is the stuff that you dissolve. Those are stuff that gets dissolved. So one example would be salt, your sodium chloride, or sugar. So when you dissolve a solute in a solution, so you dissolve let's say a sugar cube into water, you end up making a very sweet water, right? Because it's full of sugar in the water. The sugar cube no longer exists because it gets dissolved. So what you have made is a sugar solution. So solution is solute plus solvent. So liquid is your solvent, and the things that you dissolve is your solute. Together, they make a solution through dissolving the solute. That makes water a good molecule because of its a good solvent because water is polar, so its negative and positive are able to rip off other molecules that are either positive or negative. And that's all for the review session. These are all the things that you need to know for my test. Wish you guys good luck. Bye bye.